Welcome to episode 65 of Talking Dairy. My name is Ben Chapman-Smith. Well, managing internal parasites is a major challenge for farmers. Not only can worms have a big effect on animals' productivity and welfare, but current information shows many Kiwi farmers are using treatments in a way that results in drench-resistant parasites and drench failure. So what's the right approach to worm management in young dairy stock? In today's episode, you'll get a quick but thorough overview from Ginny Dodunski and Emma Poole. Ginny is a vet and the program manager of Wormwise, while Emma is a vet, Wormwise facilitator, Waikato farm owner, and of course winner of the 2023 Young Farmer of the Year competition. They explain how worms limit production in dairy calves, when the right time is to start drenching calves, how to go about choosing the right drench, but also why we need to focus far more on management factors other than drench. Ginny and Emma also discuss parasite management when calves are grazed off farm, the benefits of using oral drench, and why weighing animals is so important. Before we get into today's podcast, I have some sad news to share, sad to me at least. This is my last episode as host of Talking Dairy. I've been incredibly grateful to host this podcast since the beginning in April 2021, and it's been an absolute privilege to interview an incredible and often inspiring group of farmers, rural professionals, DairyNZ scientists and experts, some politicians, and many more. I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for listening to and supporting this podcast. We've had so many great pieces of feedback from you over the last couple of years, and that's helped to shape the topics that we tackle, who we interview, the length of our podcasts, and much more. I've absolutely loved it. I'm moving on, but DairyNZ will be continuing this podcast, so keep listening in for more great episodes. All right, well, Ginny and Emma, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. How are you both?
Great, thank you.
Just happy to be here, Ben.
Good stuff. Hey, Emma, firstly, just an official congratulations from us. Apart from doing a lot of media, has life looked much different for you since then, or have you just been straight back onto the farm and into calving?
Oh, yeah, a lot of it was timing-wise, wasn't it, Ben? So we've been straight back into calving here on the farm and pretty busy, but yeah, had a few interesting media interviews in between and certainly trying to juggle them around calves and babies. It's made life interesting, but it's all been good fun.
I bet, and thank you for giving up your time to do this as well.
It's a good cause here.
I was curious, the cloak of knowledge, do you get to take that home and just wear it around the house sometimes?
They wouldn't actually let me leave the night show with it on, so it was a bit of a shame because it fitted quite nicely, I thought. So, I had to hand that one back, but there's certainly a few interesting stories that go with that cloak.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, and Ginny, we're talking to you today you're down in Central Otago.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate to be just babysitting a friend's little sheep and beef practice down here while she has a holiday. It was always my dream to work as a vet in Central Otago, so at least for 2 weeks anyway, I get to do that and live my little dream. It's great.
Fantastic. Hey, well, let's get things going with you, Ginny. What is Wormwise?
So Wormwise is an industry initiative that was set up after a big national survey of drench resistance was done in the early 2000s of both sheep and cattle. And at that time, a rather frightening level of drench resistance was discovered, both in sheep and also in intensive beef systems where something like 92% of the farms in that survey had resistant worms on them, which was a bit of a shock to people at the time. So Wormwise was an initiative that was set up out of that. The intent of Wormwise was to stop drench resistance getting worse and to help farmers better manage worms on their farms. Yeah, it's maybe a little bit debatable how successful that's been given the place that we're in now with drench resistance, and I can talk about that later. But it is a collaboration between a number of parties. MPI were the original funders, DairyNZ, Beef and Lamb, who are the only funders of it now, Deer Industry, AFANS, who are the organisation that represent the drench manufacturers, New Zealand Veterinary Association. I think that's all. But until I was employed last year, Wormwise sort of didn't have one person running it. So like anything, if it's everybody's job, it's nobody's job. But now I'm Mr. Nobody. So I'm the one running this program and really trying to give it some traction and some visibility. So I'm really, really grateful to DairyNZ for having us on today. And I must say, in the year that I've been in the role, the people I have interacted with on the ground with DairyNZ have been super helpful at trying to get some worm management messages out to your farmers. So thank you.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Hey, Ginny, talk to us about how worms can limit production.
We have farmed for so long with drenches that were effective. Our first real broad spectrum drench, which was the benzimidazole class of drench, that came out in the early 60s. So there aren't too many farmers around now who know or remember what it was like to farm without regular drench, stopping the wheels falling off. And so particularly I find for dairy support and dairy farmers, there's a belief that as long as I'm giving my calves a regular drench, that's worm control done and dusted, and I don't need to think any more about it. What we do know, and it's really well demonstrated on farms that are able to offer calves cleaner, better quality feed with lower worm levels on it, and we've got some great research in New Zealand that demonstrates this, where we're able to graze young stock, whether that be lambs or calves, on feed that has a much lower level of worm contamination than just average perennial pasture, they can grow at twice the rate that they'll grow when they're just grazing contaminated pasture and getting regular drenches. So while regular drenching stops the wheels falling off in terms of disease and animals actually dying and that sort of thing, where we are managing our young calves and our growing stock on very contaminated pasture, we are by default limiting their potential growth rate. And, knowing how few heifers in New Zealand manage to attain, their target weights, the parasite thing is a big part of that. And there's lots of opportunities to do it better.
When's the right time for farmers to start drenching calves?
Great question, and one that, on some of the forums on Facebook that I see and, some of the questions that we veterinarians get or advice that we see farmers giving each other, that the answer to that question I don't think is very well understood. It seems to be quite common for people to start drenching calves at quite a young age, and in general, calves don't require treatment for nematode worms, the gastrointestinal worms, until they've got a fully developed rumen. So drenching calves at 3 or 4 weeks of age, or even maybe up to 8 weeks of age, you're sort of drenching them before that worm population can even really establish in the gut. So a lot of that scouring that we might see in calves early on in their life may well be coccidiosis or something else when calves are at pasture, but it seems to be quite common just to reach for the drench gun, or even worse, tip drench into the milk. Please don't do that, folks. That's not a good way of drenching calves. It really doesn't work that well. So knowing what you're dealing with is important, and also knowing that they don't really need their worms removed until they've got a functioning rumen is really important. Wormwise does have a Facebook channel. It's worth jumping on there. There's a really good little video on there actually from Emma with some of her calves showing you the difference between calves and when they might not need to start being drenched. Yeah, so drenching calves when they're really little, unnecessary, but you obviously don't want to leave them until they're clinically parasitized or coughing with lungworm or whatever. So there's a sweet spot in the middle there once their rumens are functioning and once they're actually taking in reasonable quantities of grass.
Emma, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think just as a whole, what Ginny's saying is that the biggest cost is the unseen cost. So as farmers, we often can't quantify the losses that we are coping with these parasites. And just like she said, as we think we might be on top of it with our drenches and stuff, that's not the only thing to be thinking about here. And there's so much to gain by improving the system as a whole and focusing away from the drench and more focusing on the animal and the pasture management itself and trying to get those gains there. And yeah, nutrition is really the hallmark of everything. If you can feed your animals well, it has so many benefits. So as farmers, we really need to start shifting this focus. And as a vet, one of the most common questions I'm asked is, what is the best drench to use? And it's such a shame because we really need to flip that conversation and start saying, hey, it's not actually about the drench. It's where everyone wants to start the conversation and it's where we all spend our money. But the biggest question we should be actually asking is, what's your system? What's the most appropriate thing that we can do with them? And these answers need to be tailor-made and really specific. And I know that farmers get really frustrated with us as vets in that we can't just give them a one-size-fits-all answer, but it really does have to be tailor-made to their system. And there's a lot of vets out there that have some very good knowledge that can help them make those decisions.
Excellent. Ginny, if calves are scouring early, how do you know if that's a result of worms or something else?
There's easy diagnostics on that one. I mentioned coccidiosis, and that can be tested for by collecting some individual fecal samples from calves and taking them to the vet and getting them looked at. Those little coccidiosis bugs will produce eggs that turn up in the feces. In an extreme situation, which we sometimes see with dairy lambs actually, is, if you've got animals that are really sick and dying, post-mortem is the best way to diagnose what's going on, because then you can look directly at what's going on in the gut. But yes, those fecal samples, they can tell you to what extent the scouring you're seeing is caused by coccidiosis, worms, or some other bug. And, people rearing calves are probably well familiar with all those other scour bugs. That's the answer there. Just back to Emma's point about the nutrition and that being the important part of managing calves. The other thing to realise too is the faster and the bigger that we can grow calves and really push them through that susceptible period to worms, the older and bigger they get, the more immune they get to worms. So the faster we can grow them to that kind of more robust size, then you've got less months on the farm where your calves are so susceptible and where you do have to do a lot of drenching. So those good nutrition systems where you're driving high live weight gains early on, I would argue that spending good money on providing good feed, whatever that looks like in your system, is money really well spent.
Great. You've said that drench is only part of it, but how do you go about choosing the right drench?
We could have a long chat about that, but the golden rule is to be using the most effective product for your property and for your age of calves. And we are starting to see so much drench resistance now. And just taking a step back, drench resistance is where you've got worms that were previously controlled by a certain drench, yet those worms have now genetically become resistant to that chemical or that product. So that is developing in the background on dairy heifer properties, on intensive bull beef properties. We've got properties around the country now where young calves are becoming sick with two species of worms, Couperia and Ostatagia, that can survive double drenches and triple drenches. That's getting pretty scary. And the thing about that is that you won't, if you think you're going to see that before you get sick calves, you won't. It's pretty normal on these properties for people to think that they've just been getting bog standard performance, or we've had a dry summer and then we had a rubbish autumn, and you put the poorer growth performance that you're seeing down to other aspects, while not realising that every time you're drenching, you might be leaving half the worms behind or 30% of the worms behind. And then the next time you drench, you've got the 30% that you left behind before, and then another 30%, and you're just getting this slow build-up of worms, and then get into the autumn and you start seeing sick calves. So we don't want to be there. So what's the best drench for my farm? The answer to that is maybe start the season with whatever you were going to use. Maybe it was an oral double. 10 to 14 days after giving that, just take some fresh fecal samples from about 10 calves, take it to your vet clinic and get those checked for a fecal egg count. If your drench was working well, the fecal egg count on each of those samples should be 0. If we've got eggs surviving drench, then that's the start of a conversation about, well, what is going on my farm? What is the most effective product? We then need to start checking a few other products and drilling down into what's going to work for you. I don't think it's responsible anymore for anybody selling drench to just say, she'll be right, you'll be all right with this double combination, you'll be all right with this triple combination, you'll be all right with this pour on this injection. We really don't know. As calves get older, or certainly once they're into their first and second year of age, we can relax that a little bit. But certainly with calves in their first year, I just don't think we can say anymore just that, yes, this product will be all right or this product won't be all right. So use the most effective drench, and definitely for calves, there are very good reasons why oral drenches are a better choice. It's not just your vet trying to be a humbug. We've got good science in New Zealand to show that the oral form of those drenches that we use is more effective against our most resistant worms. If we put an oral, an injectable and a pour-on up against each other in an efficacy trial against Cooperia, which is our most resistant worm, the oral blows the pour-on and the injection away. The efficacy of injections and pour-ons against that worm in the trial work that Ag Research has done is about 50%, and yet the oral form of that same drug will be working at about 90% in the trial work that's been done. So it's not just us being a pain in the ass. There's very good reasons for using oral drench in baby calves. For calves, oral drenches are the way to go, and we really should be using those up to a year of age.
They're also cheaper, Ben. It's easier for the drug companies to formulate an oral formulation rather than something that has to be absorbed through the skin and then find its way to where the worms are. So oral drenches are actually usually the cheapest as well. So as a farmer, that ticks a big box for me.
Emma, that was a question I was going to put to you, was about the benefits of using oral drench over pour-ons while calves are young, and Ginny's answered that fairly well. But I also wanted to ask why weighing is so important.
In terms of weighing animals, quite often as farmers we assume that we know the weights of our animals, but we can be easily 10, 20, 30 kilos off with our iometer when we're looking at these animals in the yard. So we actually want to be dosing to the heaviest animal in the mob, and if we've got a large variation of animals within that mob, we want to be splitting them into several lines so that the smaller animals aren't getting heavily overdosed and the larger animals are getting the appropriate dose, because we don't want to be under-drenching these animals. So when you are yarding your animals, if you can weigh them and tailor your drench dose appropriately, that will really help. It also reduces drench wastage. So if you are assuming your cattle are 200 kilos and they're only 150, there's a 50 kilo margin there that you don't want to be wasting that drench. So actually weighing them and keeping a good grip on things is really, really important.
Great. Ginny, what are some of those management factors that farmers can change to reduce their reliance on drench?
For dairy support systems, that can be a bit of a difficult question to answer if the only enterprise on the farm is dairy support. You know, as I spoke about earlier in the podcast, the power of being able to offer calves feed that doesn't have too many worm larvae on it is massive. And, you know, how we go about creating that feed is one of a number of things. Obviously, probably the cleanest type of feed would be something like a summer brassica, where you've turned the pasture over, put in a leafy crop where worm larvae don't survive or thrive very well. You know, that's going to be a very worm-free feed. Something like chicory, plantain, all of those types of leafy crops tend to be lower in worms and also obviously better nutrition. And then you've sort of got a sliding scale below that where feed will be cleaner or more contaminated. Autumn sown new grass is often very good. Perennial pasture or short rotation pasture that's been grazed by either fully immune adult cattle or an alternative species like sheep or deer is also useful. That said, a few weeks of that type of grazing probably isn't enough to clean it up to a substantial level. So we're sort of talking about area swaps of months, not weeks, to create cleaner feed for calves. But on that, you know, one of the simple things you may be able to do, depending on your block, is just to make sure that the paddocks that the newly arrived calves go onto each year aren't the same ones each year. You know, because the younger the calves are, the more worm eggs they will produce and put out onto pasture, because the calves themselves lack immunity to the worms. So the worms can just go and reproduce at whatever rate they want to. But as the months go by, the calf's immune system starts to limit the egg production out of those worms. So trying to change areas each year so that our new arrivals go on a different area in November or December than they went on last year. Just starting to think like that. And I realise, with some little runoffs and stuff, that stuff's just going to be really difficult to do. But that does then lead to the question of how sustainable some of these runoffs are going to be in the very long term with regard to, worm management as we start to get worms that are surviving our drenches. Did a Wormwise workshop up in the Rotorua area a couple of months ago, and the farmers in that workshop, there was quite a variety in terms of how they were able to manage that grazing of young calves. But one of the attendees at that workshop, very much just had a small block that always had young calves on it. And when we compared sort of the live weight gains that the calves on their block were doing compared to some of the performance on the other blocks where there was more integration of other stock classes or they were part of a sheep system or whatever, that girl really took a step back and went, holy heck, we've got a worm factory here. What are we going to do about it? And yeah, I think this is something that dairy farmers are going to have to start grappling with a little bit more, because the drench resistance tidal wave that's happened in the sheep industry, we've got no reason to believe that it's going to be any different in young cattle systems. And we're already seeing, some of these systems starting to tip. And so getting ahead of that and starting to think about, well, if I've got this little worm factory where I've just got the same R1 animals going round and round and round every year, how much longer can I keep doing that for? Is that a good use of that land? Am I better for these calves to be going out to a professional grazier who can integrate them into a bigger system? These are some of the thought processes and discussions that we're going to have to start having, because it's not just as simple as changing a drench anymore.
Emma, you graze many of your calves on your own runoff, right?
Yes, we do. Yep. So we've got a separate block that's separate to the dairy farm where all the young stock are kept. So we run a parasite factory in essence, but we carefully manage it to make sure that we are achieving our goals still.
Yeah, so talk to us about, what that parasite management plan looks like and, why it's so important to have it in place.
Yeah, so achieving these growth rates for us is absolutely essential, because we know that well-grown heifers produce more once they reach the dairy herd. So reaching these targets is really essential for us. With our runoff, it is a monoculture of cattle, which is unfortunate, but we know we're not good sheep farmers, so we don't have a lot of sheep to integrate into the system. So what we've tried to keep our primary focus on with the runoff is nutrition. So we integrate a lot of cropping rotation into where those calves are, and we've found that we can achieve great growth rates with that, and that our drenches are still working for us. So it is carefully monitored, and we do take regular fecal samples. But like I say, if we keep the focus on nutrition there, the rest of it comes easily. So we know that a lot of larvae live in the bottom 2 centimetres of pasture. So if you're asking calves or cattle to graze really, really low and pushing them hard, aka you're offering them less nutrition, then they're also going to pick up more larvae as well. So the way we manage it is we try to keep high covers. We try to keep a lower stocking rate. We integrate crops, forage crops, where like Ginny talked to. So things like chicory work really well in the summer, grazable turnips, that sort of thing. But we also have to be careful that when we put these crops back into annual for the winter period, that we're managing them appropriately too, because once they're turned into an annual for the winter, they're almost considered a clean feed. So we don't want to be drenching animals and putting them straight onto that grass, because the only parasites that they'll shed on the annual is the resistant ones that have survived the drench. So it's really important that we're thinking about, okay, what rotation do we have ahead of us? Where can these animals go to once they've been drenched? And how can we integrate the slightly older stock? So we do have 2-year-olds up at the runoff, and we know that they are more immune to parasites than the likes of the calves. So we try to integrate them into a cropping and grass rotation, so that they're all getting across different parts of the farm, and that we're not just restricting the calves to one area.
Great. Ginny, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I was just about to ask Emma how she integrates, because you've got your R1s and your R2s. So you talk about them grazing across, all sharing the grazing area. Do you do any sort of planned swaps where you've tried to create cleaner feed with your R2s that calves go onto, or is it just a bit more that they're all sort of, the R2s are following the R1s in rotation, or how do you work that?
Yeah, no, they definitely get changed around, and sometimes it's a matter of practicality. So we know that the R2s might need yarding in the next 2 weeks, so they get rotated closer to where the yards are, and the calves might get pushed away further. But as you're doing that, you're sort of naturally cycling them between the different grazing areas, and I really do think that helps to start cleaning up the pasture. But yeah, we do try to be mindful of where the larvae contamination is at any one time, and like I say, just avoiding putting those calves back out into those paddocks year after year. And from an anecdotal point of view, on the dairy farm, we've found that it's become more challenging for us to rear calves because we were using some paddocks year after year, and the level of disease in those paddocks was becoming challenging to manage. So we've actually had to adapt what we're doing here, and we've broadened the area that we run calves on when we're doing the rearing phase, and we're rotating them in 2-year cycles. So we might use one set of paddocks for a short period of time, and then we might move the calves to the back of the farm, and we're hoping that we won't have to come back to that area for a year or so. And in the meantime, it'll be grazed by dry cows and even milkers, and that can help to clean up some of that larval contamination.
Cool. Emma, you also graze some of the calves off, don't you?
Yep, so we have sent some calves off to grazing for the next 18 months until they join us back here on the dairy platform. So that's just a numbers problem. Our runoff's not big enough to cope with all of these animals, and like I said, we want to be feeding them properly, so we've offloaded some for sure.
What conversations do you have with the grazier about parasite management? How do you set clear expectations? And why is it important to have a grazing contract in place?
From a vet's perspective, Ben, I've found the grazing contracts really essential, not just for parasites, but for management in general. There's often a difference in expectation between what the grazier thinks is going to happen and what the farmer thinks is going to happen. So it's really important to have upfront conversations and discuss how the calves are going to be managed. Who are they going to be mixed with? Where are they going to be? What the drenching program is going to be? And put all these sort of things into a contractual agreement, because even the best of relationships can turn sour when things get tough. And we know that we're facing a lot of pressures at the moment. So you want to set yourself up for success. And one of the first parts of that is having an open communication plan at the very beginning before the calves enter the grazing agreement. So yeah, we have ensured that we do have a sound contract behind us, and there's different sorts of contracts out there too, isn't there? You can have weight for gain contracts where you pay based on a weight gain, or there's a weekly fee as well. So establishing that sort of thing helps. But one of the main things we try to focus on is receiving and communicating data. So with these heifers at grazing, we expect that our grazier will get in contact with us with regular weights so that we can keep an eye on that. So by looking at weight gain data, we can essentially see what sort of nutrition is being offered from afar, and also whether we think the things like parasites are becoming challenging. So with that, you can keep the lines of communication open for future plans as well. So deciding when to drench and that sort of thing. So it's difficult to set a drench plan ahead for the next year because seasons change, temperatures change, worm burdens change. So we'd just like to keep those channels open so that we can adapt as the seasons change.
Something I would add to that too is if you're grazing your heifers out on a sheep and beef farm, a lot of sheep and beef farmers, the better ones, are very aware of all this drench resistance, parasite management, larval contamination, these sorts of things, because they're having to learn to deal with it a lot more with their sheep. And so having a good conversation with those sheep and beef farmers about how best to manage the parasites in your heifers, you may well find that you actually learn quite a bit from them. You may have to provide some direction in terms of grazing and nutrition, but I suggest you'll probably learn some things about parasites from your sheep and beef farmer as well.
Ginny, just a final question for you. What's the best way to test for parasites?
While in quite young calves, a fecal egg count is a reasonable guide to the level of worms on board. Reasonably quickly as the months go by, egg counts in young cattle become less of a good guide than they are in sheep. And so we just need to take those with a little bit of a grain of salt. And I wouldn't want anybody to come away from this podcast thinking that they're just going to start fecal egg counting calves and then using that as a guide to drench, because quite quickly, certainly in that 6 to 9 month age group anyway, you can have calves that have relatively low fecal egg counts, yet they can still have a reasonable worm burden on board that's limiting their growth and production. So the monitoring is never one factor, right? It's a multifactorial sort of algorithm in your mind in terms of if we're egg counting, what are the egg counts? If the egg counts are really high, well, that's easy. That tells you exactly what's going on. If they're zero, in older cattle, that might mean nothing. Older cattle can sometimes be under pressure from osteotagia, which is a worm that sits in their abomasum, from that worm without having an egg count at all. And those kind of mid-range age of calves can have a low egg count and still be under pressure. So you've got the egg counts, you've got the feed that they've been on in terms of how contaminated it might be, you've got the level of grass that they're grazing, whether they're getting any supplement or not, because that obviously influences their level of larval intake, and then just the growth rates that they're doing, the season that you're in, how wormy is the season this summer and autumn that we've been through, and in a lot of parts of New Zealand, the winter has been reasonably mild as well. That all favours worm development and survival, whereas if we get a decent drought, that'll knock a whole lot of larvae out on the pasture. So it's this sort of algorithm between the monitoring data, your iometer and your stockmanship in terms of what you can see and what's there in front of you. So yeah, it's not one thing. And just be aware that fecal egg counts, while they're a good guide in young calves, they become less reliable as calves get older.
Emma, anything to add?
Yeah, it's just about looking at the whole picture, isn't it, rather than just one tool. Like Ginny said, that we don't have a golden rule for deciding when to drench, so consider all factors closely before you make decisions, really.
Ginny and Emma, thank you so much for everything you've shared on the podcast today. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
One thing I would add, folks, is just keep an eye out for Wormwise workshops in your area. Just a plug for Wormwise. Beef and Lamb have had a lot of feedback from their levy payers that they want more action and more education around parasite management and managing drench resistance. So you probably, if you're not already, you'll start to see cattle-specific Wormwise workshops cropping up in your area. We will be working hard to make sure that they're in the dairy diary as well, and trying to work a little bit more on the ground with DairyNZ staff as well. So these things should be popping up in your area, and if they're not, ask for them and we'll get them going. So yeah, come along and learn some stuff.
Great. We'll put a link to Wormwise in the show notes as well for listeners. And Emma?
I'd just say that as farmers, you know your own system the best, so you're probably best able to make a parasite management plan that suits you and is tailor-made. But to make that plan, you need understanding. So, yeah, looking for resources or joining us at these workshops will really help you to broaden your understanding, and then these things won't seem so scary and you'll be able to make decisions on the go as the seasons change.
And follow Wormwise on Facebook as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time, for your knowledge, experience, and just sharing a lot of great practical stuff on the conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode, and thank you to Ginny and Emma for generously sharing your time and knowledge. Check the show notes for some useful links on this topic. Now, if you have any feedback or ideas for future episodes, please send an email to talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz. That's it from me. Thank you for listening, and all the best.